When you use the Dremel DigiLab 3D slicer the first time you open it, you're going to have to pick what type of printer you're using. I'm using a 3D40 printer, so I go ahead and I click 3D40. You can name it anything you want. If you have multiple printers, this is useful. However, not for me at the moment. I go ahead and I add it. It's asking if I want to connect to the networked printer. Right now, where I'm at, it is not possible to put the printer on the network because the network blocks it. So I'm just going to hit Finish. Now you can see I have the space to work in. Let's go ahead and open a file. Here you can see I've opened a small file. Now, in order for me to move around, I'm going to have to use Control and then right-click to change where I'm looking, and then Shift and right-click to physically move the camera. So I can look around. I can see we have a little figure playing bagpipes. He looks nice and fun. He also looks very small. I can check how tall he is by clicking on him. Now once I've clicked on him, if I go to Scale, I can see that his height is 32 millimeters, and we have his various other sizes here. Now, by using uniform scaling, if I were to either make his height by typing it, let's say 50 millimeters, or if I wanted to reduce his height by 50% from the original, he would be smaller. Or, in our case, I would like to make him 200% taller. You can also scale by pulling on one side or the other on these different X, Y, and Z coordinates. So for the time being, let's make him nice and large. You can also rotate him using the bars to move him around on the 3D printing. You can also choose to lay him flat. Often the lay flat option does not work very well. Some of this may take a minute to do. In this case, all it did is really turn him around. Next up, you have mirror. If you wanted to change which direction he's looking, you can do that. There's lots of ways to move him around. It'll essentially be a flip. The final thing we have is, having selected him, we can also move him around on the build platform itself. This is something you may want to use if you're opening multiple objects. Next, let's look at the basic settings. For the Dremel that we're using, we're going to use PLA, which is a vegetable oil-based plastic, and it gives off fewer particulates in the air and is much safer to use. The Dremel 3D40 can use high quality as its settings. However, there are lower qualities if you want to increase speed but decrease quality. For the most part, what you're going to be printing, you want to use high quality. Next, you have infill. Infill is what happens when you create this. Instead of filling every inch of this with plastic, what you want to do instead is create an internal structure that will give your model strength but also reduce the overall cost of printing. The density of your infill will increase strength, but it will also increase the time and the cost to 3D print something. Here we have the generic setting of generate supports. Once we use this, it will create lines that go all the way up and down for any pieces that overhang, like on his bagpipes. You also have build plate adhesion. What this does is it creates one of many different ways of build plate adhesion, and currently the way that this Dremel 3D40 uses as a default is to create a built-up line around the base, and that will help cooling. Next, you have the custom settings. This is where things get crazy. Before we go to custom settings, if you're good with using the recommended settings and you have everything set the way you'd like, which, by the way, if I was printing this and I was just using recommended settings, I would be using the 50% infill because it'll give the model much more strength for the breakable parts here. So, if we go to custom settings, we have more versions of the quality. You can change the layer height. Shells is how thick the outer layers are. This is a setting that you need to be aware of when messing with. If you make the outer layers thicker, it will increase the cost and time. Infill, it's like we said, but if you want to customize it, I generally prefer to do infill in customization rather than just a 2050. Material. These temperatures, if you're using different types of material, you may need to change if you're using something like Ninja Flex. However, most likely you're just going to be using PLA. So don't mess with these unless you get into expert mode. Speed, it comes down to print speed. The slower you speed, the more likely you are to have fewer screw-ups. Cooling, again, this is just simple. Whether the printer cools it or not, it's always a good idea to have it cool it. Supports. This is where things get crazy. There's lots of different types of supports you could use. There's touching the build plate, so only the parts where it wouldn't touch the build plate, or everywhere, which will create supports. We can take a look at difference. When you start messing with supports is when things start to get really crazy. Build plate adhesion is how it sticks to the build plate. So what I was talking about was a skirt, and then there's brim, raft. Raft is essentially a lower layer that you end up having to peel the model off of. So first you peel up the model, and then you peel it off the raft. Rafts are an older way of doing it, and they are very stable. But I did not. You also find that they create a more messy bottom. I'm not so sure about the brim. I've never used it, but skirt has been fine for most of the things I print. And then special modes, print all at once or print one at a time. Always choose print all at once. There's only bad things will happen if you do print one at a time. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to send this file to the USB card. And what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the recommended settings and we're going to hit prepare. Once we hit prepare, we go through the process of waiting for it to fully do this. I'm going to skip ahead in this video because this can take a while. Okay, it's finished preparing and slicing the image. Before I save it to the video, or before I save it to the USB card, I can look at the layers to see how this is going to come up. Now you'll see that this is what our final build is going to look like. All of this will have to be picked off, and this can be very destructive to the product, to the final design. To do that, you need to be careful with this. This is why when using when using infill, you need a stronger infill, because the breakable parts will come off when you're trying to break the other parts. There are more advanced ways of doing this. In fact, I actually prefer Simplify 3D as a way of creating supports for these. It makes much better supports, but I'm just showing you the Dremel DigiLab 3D because that's the thing that is the no-cost product for using this. Also, this will estimate about how long. In my experience, I found that these estimates are usually very low. It usually ends up taking about 20% longer than the estimate says, and I have no idea if these estimates for how much material it will use are correct or not. So once you have all of the slices done, you don't need to look at this unless you're curious how it's going to look. You can hit save to removable drive, and once you do that, it will automatically save to the removable drive, and then it will ask you if you'd like to eject the drive. Unless you're making more prints, you say yes, you eject the drive, and now you can go stick it in the printer and you're ready for the next part. Once you've created the G-code file, you're then going to take the USB drive that you have and you're going to insert it into the front of the 3D printer. Now the 3D printer, I just turned it on. It's going through a setup phase. It might make some beeping noise. When you need to turn the 3D printer on, you can see the switch on the side. Now you go to the file that you'd like to create. You can hit build. You will hit USB, and then you will pick the file that you'd like it to build. Additionally, if you need to do anything else, you can go back here. Hitting the level button will walk you through leveling it, and it'll even tell you how right or wrong it is. You hit the filament button if you want to change the color of the filament or replace filament that exists. Also, it helps you if the filament breaks, like the filament did recently. I try to have the lid open when it runs and the filament above it to do the least amount of pulling on it so that it doesn't break as often. Other tools in here, you may need to do jog mode to offset it, but I wouldn't recommend that unless you're very comfortable with it. And then there's nothing else in here you need to really worry about. So that is how to run the Dremel 3D printer. The 3D printer is a Dremel 3D40 is the type of 3D printer this is, in case anything asks for the model. And then in order to take something off of the build plate, you open the door. You'll see there's a little clip right here that releases the build plate, and you pull it off. Never try to take things off of the build plate while it's still attached, because that will mess up the raising and lowering mechanism. You always want to take it off first. And you also want to replace the blue tape whenever it starts getting too torn up. In fact, I should probably replace the blue tape on this now. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me, and I'll be happy to answer them for you. Beyond that, like I said, I usually have the filament coming out the top, but you can also replace the filament on the door on the back, and you just turn this one of these ways. There we go. It pops off. You feed the filament through the tube at the bottom, and then set the filament roll into it. So, enjoy.